Well, thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation with Sami Awad and Stu Gerard, or Stu G. Sami is joining us from his home in Bethlehem, and Stu is zooming in from Nashville. Today's webinar is the second in a series featuring voices from Bethlehem. We're coming to you at a time when Christians around the world are celebrating Advent and preparing for Christmas, which of course all began in Sami's hometown in Bethlehem. Today's conversation will give us a chance to talk about the oft-used words of Jesus, blessed are the peacemakers, and what that means to Sami and to Stu. And we'll also talk about one of the universal principles of peacemaking, which is a commitment to nonviolence as a way of life. My name is Todd Deatherage. I'm one of the co-founders of Telos, along with Greg Khalil, who's also on the call today. And I'm speaking to you from just outside Washington, D.C. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Telos is an American nonprofit based here in Washington, and our mission is to form communities of peacemakers across lines of difference and equip them to help reconcile seemingly intractable conflict at home and abroad. So we're really excited for today's discussion, but before we get started, I want to invite all of you to go into the chat function, introduce yourself, tell us where you're tuning in from, and this is also a place where you can put your questions as we go. We will have a dedicated time for Q&A at the end of the moderated discussion, and we'll do our best to get as many questions in as we can. So start as they come to you, just start putting your questions in the chat function. So let's get started. Sami, let's begin with your story. For many of you who have met Sami, if you've been on one of our Telos trips, but for those of you who don't know Sami, you come from a well-known Palestinian Christian family. Your father, Bashara, founded the Bethlehem Bible College. Your uncle, Mubarak, is a prominent leader, or was a prominent leader of the Palestinian nonviolence movement during the First Intifada and beyond, who was forced into exile by the Israelis and now lives in the United States because of his work teaching and organizing nonviolence. You yourself studied nonviolence in the US and then went back to Palestine in the 90s to take up the mantle of your uncle's work, and you did trainings and you led protests, and then you had a set of sort of transformative experiences that led you into an even deeper understanding of what it means to be a peacemaker and to practice nonviolence as a way of life. Can you tell us a little bit of your own story and about your own growing understanding of nonviolence as a way of life?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Todd and Greg and Telos for this invitation. And it's so good to be with the Stu in this platform. Miss you guys. And it's good to see all the people here joining us for this webinar. Yeah, I guess my story with nonviolence began on a very personal level when I was 12 years old. It was the first time I joined a nonviolent protest, a nonviolent action that was led by my uncle on Palestinian land. The intention was to plant olive trees on a land that was threatened by a nearby Israeli settlement, actually not far from Bethlehem, if you know that area. And it was the first time I met Israeli nonviolent peace activists. I didn't know they even existed until that time. And so there was a busload of us, Palestinians and Israelis, going to this piece of land. And I remember the clear instructions from my uncle. You are here to plant trees. No matter what happens, you're here to plant trees. So I took my little olive tree and looked my little tool, and I started digging to plant my olive tree on this land. And as soon as we started, the Israeli army and settlers came, and they were yelling and shouting and demanding for us to leave. And I remember not knowing what to do, but just continuing digging my little hole to plant my little tree. And then at one point, an Israeli soldier came from behind me and grabbed the tree that I had just placed in the hole and threw it on some rocks nearby. And my memory was, what I remembered at that time was a decision that I needed to make. As a child, as a 12-year-old child, when you're faced with a soldier with a machine gun who did something like this, it's very easy to run away. It's very easy to cry. It's very easy to want to hide, to regret even showing up. But all I could remember was plant the tree. You are here to plant the tree. And so as soon as I saw the shadow of that soldier walk away, the first thing I did was grab that tree and put it back in the hole and covered it with dirt. And I remember the sense of absolute empowerment that I had doing that action. When I'm asked sometimes what is a word that you put parallel to nonviolence, it's empowerment. You are empowered, you are in full decision making, and you are ready to face whatever consequences that come your way. And I think that experience shifted my whole life at the age of 12, where I began to follow my uncle and his teachings. I was witness to his deportation. He was arrested by the Israeli army. And then one scene I remember, it's stuck in my mind, was when they were pulling him out of court. When the decision was made to deport him, they took him straight from court to the airport. And with all the press and all the supporters that were standing outside the court to see him, he was shackled with his hands and his legs, and there was a chain between his hands and his feet. And in one split second, he looked at me and smiled as they were driving him. He had lost the case, he was going to be deported, and he smiled. And that shows another aspect of nonviolence, that sense of inner peace and success. Even in the midst of him losing, in a way, he was deported, it was a victory. It was a victory that there was so much attention, that nonviolence was seen as such a threat by the Israeli authorities, that they took a Palestinian who's also an American citizen, despite the protest of the American government, and kicked him out, never allowed him to return and live here again. And so my journey has been experience after experience of nonviolence, and reaching the point, as you mentioned, where after I started the organization, a big focus of my engagement in nonviolence was coming from a strategic approach to nonviolence, which was just to resist occupation for the sake of liberating the West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem to establish a state. It was politically motivated nonviolence. And I have to be honest and to say that a lot of that nonviolence wasn't aimed at peacemaking. It was aimed at a liberation. I wanted to get rid of the enemy so I would have my freedom. And my deepest experiences in that journey was in rereading Jesus and his teachings, the Beatitudes being a big part of them, but also as important, the verse where he commands his followers to love their enemy. If Jesus was anything, we could say is he's nonviolent, but he was completely embodied in an expression of love, even to those who were your enemy. And for me, that started a very deep journey to begin to understand what does it mean for me as a Palestinian to engage in resistance, to engage in fighting my oppressor, my suppressor, and at the same time, live love towards them, to really understand who they are. And I've shared this with almost everybody who's heard me. The big turning point, and I'll end here, was when I was invited to go to Auschwitz and Birkenau in Poland to the death camps. And that visit really made me understand what it means to love the enemy, to understand the story of my enemy. What makes my enemy an enemy? What makes my enemy violent towards me? People are not born violent. God doesn't create us violent towards each other. It doesn't plant violence in us. Something happens to us that shifts us into that space. And until we begin to understand what is behind the action, not just look at the action, what is behind the action, then I feel we will never really be engaged in real peacemaking work.
I mean, I think that's so powerful. I think you may need to unpack that a little more for us. I mean, the whole notion of loving your enemy is such a difficult thing to get your head around. First of all, you're sort of figuring out who your enemy is. And I think that was a part of your own story of kind of really, and then figuring out what it looked like to do that. And how is that different from just sort of allowing something really bad to continue to happen to you that is happening?
Yeah. So for me, what I realized that what makes my enemy, and I can say this in almost all contexts of animosity and violence. Even in the United States, when we talk about the violence that exists there today and racism that exists there today, if we ask what is behind it all, one of the key issues we find, maybe not the only one, but a key issue is fear, and fear that is driven by trauma. And And for me to begin to understand the narrative of the Jewish community globally, not just the Israeli community, but the Jewish globally community, a community that has been experiencing oppression and suppression and trauma for 2,000 years, if not more. I'm not at fault, I'm not to blame for that, but I am also a victim of that experience as well. And so when there's an experience of deep pain and trauma that a community suffers, and the high point, of course, as we all know, being the Holocaust and what happened during the build up and during the Second World War, and the experience of complete annihilation or attempt annihilation of a group of people and the survival of that group, but never experiencing real healing and reconciliation. There was a lot of guilt towards the Jewish people. There was a lot of trying to make up for what the world did to the Jewish people, but a real closure of healing never took place. A real end to anti-Semitism was never really engaged in during that time. We give them the state, we give them what they want, and we take the guilt and shame off of us. This is sort of the European mindset, maybe even the American mindset. But that community remained traumatized, and fear became the motivation of how they dealt with others. How can you engage in peacemaking when you don't trust anybody? How can you engage in peacemaking with me as a Palestinian when you don't trust me? And so for me it was this very important point to begin to understand that until we engage in the healing of the traumas, our collective traumas, even as Palestinians, what happened to us in 48 has never been addressed as a collective trauma for us that has collectively influenced us in our behavior, in our psychology, and how we relate to ourselves, how we understand our identity and the other. How do we trust others? How we don't trust others? We have never engaged in this deep work as a Palestinian community because we always have to show resiliency. We have to show steadfastness and resistance to the oppressor, but never addressing our own trauma. And for me, I link it all back to Jesus. That was the amazing connection for me, because if Jesus did anything in addition to giving amazing talks, the second thing he did most was healing. And I began to ask the question, well, as growing up in Sunday school, when we heard the story of Jesus doing miracles and especially healing, for me it was the person who wanted to be the superhero, who wanted to show how great he is. Look at me, I can heal people. You have to believe in me because I'm healing the blind, I'm healing the lame, I'm raising people from the dead. And we learned that it was all about him showing how great he is and the miracles that he did. And what I realized in this journey was that Jesus wasn't healing to show off. He didn't need to do that to convince us that he's the Messiah. He could have done many other things. He was actually healing us to completely empower us, to liberate us from the constraints that did not allow us to live the life God wanted us to live. And trauma, physical, emotional, psychological, are constraints that limit us from living the way God intends our life to be lived. And when we are led by trauma, we are led by fear. And when we are led by fear, then we are led by every means to try to protect ourselves from threat. And if you bring trauma and fear and power, just like what the state of Israel have, then I would say we have a catastrophe. And this is what we experience as a Palestinian, the catastrophe. And I think even many Israelis are experiencing the catastrophe now of absolute power being manipulated by absolute fear within their own community. And so for me, what has become a key component of peacemaking and a key component even of nonviolent activism is the deep trauma healing work that needs to happen in our communities.
Wow.
Amazing.
That's incredible, Sami. The links between fear and conflict seem really obvious. The way in which the work of justice and peacemaking done in a spirit of love and healing is very counterintuitive and sounds incredibly hard. There's a former pastor, a friend of mine here in the US, who was writing something the other day about our own dramas in America right now and our own polarization. And he used a quote from the Bible that says, perfect love casts out fear, but he turned it around and he said, perfect fear casts out love. When we are consumed by fear, then we lose that ability to sort of see the humanity in others that we perceive as enemies or that are our enemies. But this is really hard stuff. So I appreciate you unpacking some of that for us today. I think there are probably a lot of questions about that we have. Stu, I'm going to draw you into this conversation. You are a very acclaimed guitarist, musicians. You travel the world with a band called Delirious, and you still travel with other bands as a guitarist now, and have this storied music career. You moved from your native UK to Nashville, maybe, was it 10, 12 years ago now?
10 years.
Yeah, and you went on a journey to Israel and Palestine with Telos a number of years ago. And before the Telos trip started, you spent some time at a music festival in Bethlehem with Sami.
Yes.
And so you met Sami, you heard all this kind of crazy talk that Sami does, and you became very captured by it. You want to tell a little bit about your own journey into this work?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I still very much feel like a student of yours, Todd, and Sami. Very grateful for the work that Telos does, and that you're all doing. So yeah, I guess many years ago, when Delirious was still going as a band, I was captivated by the Sermon on the Mount. I felt like, that it's an essential scripture, and the Beatitudes kind of came into focus for me, because I thought that we would make an album based on the themes in the Beatitudes. Simple as that. Like, it always feels like a good time to sing about peacemaking, or purity of heart, or, to get alongside the poor, like lift up some of those themes. And that was simply it. And then the band finished. We never got around to doing it. And it threw me into like an upside down space, like a transitional, I felt like, is my best work behind me? It's kind of like I lost control of things. And it was in that space that I kind of started to realize that the Beatitudes are upside down, like they're announcements of like presence. So when they're not a list of things to attain to get to become blessed. I discovered that really they're announcements of what, who, and where God is blessing, and they hold an invitation for us to push into those things. So and I realized that the blessing is presence, that God is on your side, like when you are peacemaking, when you are crushed in spirit, like the presence of God is with you. And then so I started to explore those things, met some people, was gathering stories, started to write some music, and it quickly became something that that was more than just an idea of writing songs. And one of the things that I got a chance to do was to come to Bethlehem and play at this festival. I think it was the inaugural one, wasn't it, Sami? In 2013, the Bethlehem Live Festival. And so much of that trip, including the week that I spent with you, Todd, and the rest of the Telos team, was absolutely life-changing for me. And one of the things regarding peacemaking, I think that for anyone that's not been on a trip, a Telos trip to the Holy Land, there's something that everyone experiences on there that we kind of call the whiplash moment, because we're able to go there and visit holy sites, and but beyond that, one day you'll visit Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum, and then in the afternoon you'll be sitting in a refugee camp in Bethlehem or on the West Bank somewhere, and that kind of whiplash of like, I never knew it was like this, And so regarding peacemaking, I've definitely taken away a few things that I've learned from Sami and other folks like Daoud Nassar, Palestinian farmer, a place called the Tent of Nations. And he said to me once that we can't begin to offer peace as a solution until we have received peace as a gift on the inside. And so You know, for me, growing up in the West, I have the privilege of being able to look at some of these things from a distance, right? And I can switch them off in my brain. But when you internalize something to finding peace within yourself, like you can't turn that off. Like you have to confront it, right? And so that's what I've learned is that peacemaking is not a passive thing. It's not just about knowledge. It's not just about talking about it. It's not just about peacekeeping, but it's actually about it's not an absence of conflict, but it's confronting these things. And I felt like the walls that separate Israel from the West Bank, from Palestine, are a picture of what it means for all of us to be able to step behind from our comfort and from our security and onto the contested space. And so one of my big takeaways has been that how Sami does peacemaking is how we do it in our contested spaces back home too. That we might not be in a violent hotspot, but the principles are the same. And that I think, you know, to live life through the lens of the Beatitudes for me means that it costs me my comfort. You know, it costs me my ability to switch off to the people that I've met in the Holy Land.
Wow. It is costly, and I think that's a really important point of this. To live all this out can be a very costly thing in a lot of ways. Sami, how do you react to that? What's the price you think that you pay for committing yourself so fully to this way of life and this way of resistance and this way of pursuing justice and freedom and dignity and all the things that you've devoted your life to in this particular way?
Yeah, I fully agree with what Stu said, and for me, I think one of the sad ironies of peacemaking is that it's become sort of an ego-centered sort of hero Hollywood get on the news famous aspect. I look at politicians, for example, here who are called peacemakers, people who win local, like when our leaders won the Nobel Peace Prize as peacemakers, when the Oslo peace process was signed as peacemakers. And for me, I have to say the way we are called to be peacemakers is the complete opposite of this. In the Beatitudes, I think the clear sign is the beatitude or the blessing that comes after it being the peacemaker, which is blessed are those who are persecuted. And I think it links directly with peacemaker. The proof of being a peacemaker is you're facing persecution. And I would challenge and say, if you don't face persecution, you are not a peacemaker, according to what Jesus teaches. If you are playing it safe, if you are doing it to create the walls and the security around you, if you're engaging in peace to see how much you could win diplomatically from the other side, you are not engaging in peacemaking. You are engaging in trying to create ceasefire, you're trying to engage in trying to create some political agreement, but real peacemaking takes courageous people to step beyond their own communities' expectations of them.
Yes.
Yeah. For me, I would say suffering persecution from my own community and from the other side is the sign of being a peacemaker. And as an organization, we have suffered. We have been labeled everything from normalizers to traitors. Our offices were firebombed at one point. Some people don't talk to us. And it's not like the other side likes us because of this, because we do challenge the norms. We do challenge the occupation. We do talk about justice. We do talk about the full rights of the Palestinians in this land. This is not about peacemaking in terms of reaching a political agreement. This is about the deep work of peacemaking, which is what Jesus calls us to do, which is that everybody is seen and treated as equal. as seen and treated as equal in the eye of God, to be treated as equal in our eyes as well. And if until we do this, like for me as a Palestinian, my peacemaking engagement is never now about reaching a political agreement. It is about the rights of the Palestinian being fully recognized, equal to the rights of the Jews that live in this land. And then let Caesar do what Caesar does. The politicians then figure out how to create the political framework around that. But we want to engage in peacemaking in the core of it, which is, I feel, what Jesus calls us to do. So persecution has to come with it. If you call yourself a peacemaker and not persecuted, revisit your peacemaking engagement. And I would say another thing about peacemaking, especially when it comes to the Beatitudes, is we also misinterpret the Beatitudes because we think peacemaking is about us going into conflict area and making peace between conflicting parties. And this is again a big mindset, and I would honestly say in the American Christian mindset, who think they want to come here and be peacemakers by bringing Palestinians and Israelis, and for them it is fulfillment of that beatitude. For me, when Jesus calls us to be peacemakers, that means he's calling us to engage in making peace with those who perceive us as our enemy or who we perceive as our enemy. And so when Christians come here, how much are they engaging in peacemaking as Christians with the local Muslim community, for example, as Christians with the Jewish community, as Americans with the Palestinian community, as Americans with the Israelis community? When you become a peacemaker in that way, then we could trust you that you could actually engage in peace. When you make peace with us, then we could trust you to say, yes, we could trust that you could also be a peacemaker between Palestinians and Israelis.
Yeah, that's really good, Sami. I think that one of the things that you just brought to mind is something that we talk about in the Beatitudes Project, which is about, being invited onto the hill of I was able to sit on the hillside overlooking the Galilee where Jesus spoke the Beatitudes. And, what we're saying is we're inviting people onto the hill. And to do that, we have to be willing to have the conversations of difference and, have the conversation of difference in our neighborhoods. Like you said, we've got in the South here in Nashville, there's a very strong Muslim community, and they're very much seen as the other to a lot of people. How do we bridge those gaps and have those conversations and get to a place where engagement is greater than tolerance, right? We don't just kind of live by people to tolerate them. Like that seems too harsh. It's about the engagement and actually doing the work together. And so, but something you said brought up a question for me. And you talked about the political solution being something that you're not too worried about. And I remember having conversations with you about, is it a two-state solution you want or whatever? But when you said about there being no kind of healing or closure to both Israelis or Palestinians, and it reminded me of what happened in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation stuff. And do you feel like, is that something you look to and think, oh, we need something like that here? And I know that is flawed, as well, but
yeah, as flawed as it was, there was some really strong merit in it. And I think the premise and the core of it was really strong for South Africa. And yeah, we all know very well that it had many mistakes in it and many shortcomings. And I think at one point this also needs to happen here, but it needs to happen not as punishment. And I think for us, this is also the big issue. Even when we talk about justice, we sometimes, I think we misinterpret justice as punishing those who did harm to us, getting back what we lost, making them pay for what they did to us. And I think if a Truth and Reconciliation Commission should emerge here, I think, again, it should be driven by how do we create a space of deep reconciliation and deep love and deep community building between the nations in this land. It is about making people, yes, pay for the atrocities that they have committed, but not in the sense as punishment, as a sense of taking responsibility for what they have done in the past. And the best, the ideal would be that they come forward, like many people did in South Africa, and said, we have done 1, 2, 3, and we seek repentance and we seek forgiveness. And
Yeah.
then repentance and forgiveness is given when it's coming from the heart as well.
Wow.
It's awesome.
So, I mean, Sammy, you alluded to something I think is really important. Sometimes when we take folks there and they meet people like you, or they meet our friends in the parent circle, um, or in other groups doing this kind of work, it's easy to see you as these sort of superheroes of peacemaking. Like you're superhuman in some way in the way that you have chosen to live in the world. And I don't want to discount how amazing you are and what you do, but I also realize that you are just you're an ordinary man like me, and you're like all the rest of us on this call, but you have been sort of in a crucible of really difficult circumstances, had to sort out some really difficult things, and you have done extraordinary things even as an ordinary person as a result of that. But each of us have an ability, even in our ordinary lives, to embrace these kinds of things, to embrace nonviolence as a way of life, to embrace the work of peacemaking. The two of you have done it out of your own Christian faith and tradition, and so we're highlighting the Palestinian Christian community in our webinar series this December, in the lead up to Christmas, for obvious reasons. But there are a lot of folks on this call and in our network who are not coming from a Christian faith tradition, but you're also talking about things in universal ways. You're tapping into things that are universal. That's what I'm trying to say. The pursuit of justice through and peace through nonviolent means and so forth. And so I wanted to know how you would speak to that, and how you work with others from other faith traditions or no faith traditions at all in common purpose. Because one of the central part of the change theory at Telos is that we bring together people in community to work across lines of difference to help bring healing. And so the whole point is to get people to work collaboratively with people who have different ideas and beliefs and backgrounds than each of us. So tell me a little bit about some of that work that you do as well.
Yeah, and for me, I'll start by saying that some of my greatest teachers in nonviolence and peacemaking do not come from the Christian tradition. And then I say this also meaning locally. I'm not just talking about Gandhi in India. I'm talking about Muslims and Jews in this land who are fully committed to peacemaking and justice and nonviolence and healing. And they are partners and teachers to me, men and women who are engaging on this journey. And so for me, it is not exclusive to this. It's sad to see so many Christians not engaging in this, because it's so clear in our text that we have to be doing this work. But to see other religions and people who have no religion engaging in this work has been amazing for me. And for me, they are real partners in this journey of peacemaking. And they are my heroes as well. And I fully agree with you, Todd. Like, this is not about becoming a hero. This is the last thing I think any of us wants to be. Because the moment we put somebody on the pedestal, like what the church did with Jesus, then we just look at them as the hero and we forget everything about their teachings, and we just want to honor them and respect them and say wow to them. And I think this is where the biggest failure of the church has happened, when we did that to Jesus and we forgot all about his teaching, and he just became an agent of salvation and getting into heaven after that, and forget all his teachings. Once you are saved and once you believe, that's all you need to do. And Jesus was not that at all. And I think he was the most humble and the most caring for the most marginalized of people. And every single one of us can be a peacemaker the way Jesus calls us to be a peacemaker. It's a commandment. I mean, it's like we shouldn't even have a choice in this one. If you want to follow the guy, you need to follow his commandments. And you're called to love your enemy, and you're called to be a peacemaker. And these are the basics of his teachings. And if you don't do that, then don't claim yourself to be a Christian and follower of Jesus. It's that simple for me. We don't need to be following these people with lies. And like I said, it's simple to do. Like Stu said, in your neighborhood, what are you doing? What are you doing to reaching out and making peace with those who you have labeled as the enemy, who see you as an enemy because of some threat that they might feel from your own race or from your own gender? What are you doing about it? Proactively engaging in making peace with others. Yes, for some reason I happen to be in this conflict zone here, where it's very contested and very heated. But I wish if I wasn't born here and I was born in Nashville or in Dallas, that I would be listening to this talk today by somebody and saying, wow, I'm going to get off this call and knock the door at my neighbors and say, oh, I come to you in peace. What is needed for me to make peace with you?
Wow. So do you have any advice about how to live this out in your ordinary life? I mean, you obviously have had your own transformative experience. You've come back. How have you seen the world differently? How have you lived and acted differently as a result of these experiences in your own community and neighborhood and in the work that you do?
Yeah, I think something that I definitely brought back with me from the trip is being able to put a human face on stories of suffering and injustice. That has been something that has been so important to me, and something that I would urge people, rather than getting on a high horse about issues, like, go and listen to people's stories. And then that comes to the next point for me, which has totally changed the way that I live through the lens of this stuff, is that it's about listening first. And I love that on your principles and practices of peacemaking, that is number one on the practices. And we use that as number one in the Beatitudes as well, in the Beatitudes Project. What does it mean to listen? And so what I did practically was, I was fairly fresh living in America. I had no friends from the African American community. I had no friends from the Muslim community. I reached out to random people, cold calling folks, and literally did what Sami said just a minute ago, which is like, what is it like for you living here? Like, can we tell me your story? I'd love to learn about you. And so there's a couple of practical things. And it's amazing how that changes you. I sat in the house of a Syrian Muslim family who are refugees. They'd been in Nashville for 2 months. Neither of us could speak each other's language. I had a friend with me who could speak a little bit of Pidgin Arabic, and we managed to communicate, and we actually got instruments out and played music together. And then that very week, I invited one of those guys to come and play on the Beatitudes Project record. Not everyone's a musician, but there's ways that we can do that. There's ways that we can engage with the other, and it means getting a little bit uncomfortable, and going outside of our comfort zones. I think also I've learned that privilege is something that we talk about a lot at the moment. Just going back to the Beatitudes, the blessing is not for the privileged. The blessing is for those whose spirits are crushed. The blessing is for those who are grieving and mourning, and for those who ache for justice. And that's an interesting thing, that I know that both Sami and you've said, Todd, is like, there's no peace without justice. What are the areas, what are the things that I ache for change for in terms of righteousness and justice?
Wow. And that's really a good place I'd love to go next. And I know we've got a couple of questions or more in the chat. If you have other questions, please put those in, and we'll go in in a minute, we'll open it up for questions. But I want to go into that concept, that the idea of justice and peace for a second, because when people talk about peace and peacemaking, and not on this call, because people on this call generally have an understanding of what we're talking about, but peacemaking can be seen as naive. Everybody wants peace, and we all believe in king, and we also like rainbows and unicorns and bad poetry and things like that. But this is actually not any of that, right? This is really, really gritty stuff when you see it done and when you realize what it costs you. I have come to really understand in some unique way, like I've just sort of began to realize how the coercion is the easier route. Like if I have enough power or access to force or violence, like if I can make you do something, if I have some ability to try to make you do something, that's way easier than doing the harder work of trying to understand you, have you understand me, to try to do the honest work of persuasion, which is part of peacemaking. And so this is really hard stuff. But it is an incredibly important way that we pursue justice in the world. I mean, Sami, your life is shaped and marked by the fact that you live under a military occupation. So many aspects of your life are controlled by the Israeli military, and decisions affecting you are often decided by voters in a country where you have no citizenship or voting rights. There's a fundamental injustice to that part of, to the central part of your existence there. And so you've chosen this way to pursue justice. But how do you, I mean, like in a more granular way, how do you go about pursuing or demanding justice as a peacemaker, as someone committed to nonviolence? Can you give us some kind of practical ways that works out, and show us why this is a better way than some other way?
Yeah, I mean, the best way to describe it is in the past, I used to jump on one foot, which is nonviolent resistance, nonviolent activism, and then that can only take you so far. And this is why, for me, bringing the work of healing into the equation creates sort of a holistic picture. And so while we engage in understanding and recognizing, and as Stu said, listening to the pain of the other, even my oppressor. And that's what Jesus did as well. I mean, this, like, we have to always use Jesus as the example. Listening to the pain of the oppressor, listening to their wounds, and engaging in the healing work at that level, it does not negate the legitimate right of resistance to end the mechanisms of oppression that exist. There are those who benefit from being in power. People who are in power, to be honest, never voluntarily just give up power. I don't think of any example around the world where somebody was in control, in power, and all of a sudden woke up one day and said, oh, I'm just going to share my resources and share my power to the whole community. There has to be resistance to those who hold power. And nonviolent resistance, for me, is the more powerful tool. It's not just the more courageous tool, it is the more powerful tool to achieve this, because the core of nonviolence is not the demonstration or the protest. It's how do you pull power away from those who hold power by enrolling the people that supported that system into your story, into your agenda, into your vision for the future. So in the context that we are talking about, for example, and this is where, again, I say nonviolence has been misplaced, even within our own Palestinian context. It's not just about a demonstration to resist the wall. These are good, but they totally take you to a certain degree. What are you engaging in that allows Israeli citizens, Israeli Jews, to see in your vision, in your future, in your call for justice, also not just room for them, a bigger space for them than what they experience now under that system that has deceived them into thinking that it is protecting them, it is taking care of them, it is securing their existence, it is telling them to fear the Palestinians. So, I mean, like what you're saying, it's a much more challenging and difficult engagement than what we even perceive and think. And this is, again, where I said there is, even in nonviolence, a misunderstanding of it, because we are not engaging in nonviolence in a means that is really pulling power away from the dictator, from the authoritarian system, from the occupation. We still haven't reached that point yet, and we still need a lot of work, I think, as Palestinians to do this.
Wow. But that's so important. You talked about this idea of having a vision for a different kind of future. It's not Pollyannish, it's not kumbaya, but it's a different kind of future that actually allows everybody in the land to flourish. I mean, that's where and of course the Greeks had a word for that big purpose or aim you have. I assume you guys know what it is, but we do. It's called telos. I mean, this is your telos. The Greeks understood as your big purpose, your aim, and you orient your life, your practices, your praxis in a way that directs you toward a proper and a worthy telos. And that is the way you kind of get out of this. This is exactly the core of what Martin Luther King Jr. did. He had a proper telos, what he called the beloved community, but a different arrangement. It wasn't a flipping of the tables that he was after. He was trying to create a different kind of reality that would allow everyone to flourish, and that even his enemies and opponents would better flourish in that reality. But that's really hard, isn't it?
What we are called to do. The beloved community is the kingdom community. This is the only thing we are called to do. And I think, as Stu said, our privilege in identity, our privilege in resources, our privilege in race is blinding us from actually engaging in the real work that we are called to do. We are more afraid of losing what we have than gaining the kingdom. This is the biggest challenge, I think, in the church, especially in the United States. We are more afraid as Christians in the United States of losing everything that we have gained instead of losing everything and sacrificing everything for something greater, which is the manifestation of the kingdom on this earth. And we have the ability to do this, and we're losing it all the time.
Yeah, I love something that Todd says about the mutual flourishing thing, is that I want for my neighbor what I want for myself. So I want from what I want for my family and my kids and my grandkids, security, education, jobs, the hope of a good future, like, and to be a peacemaker means that that's what you want for your enemy. It kind of brings that human thing to it again.
Yep, it so does. All right, so we're ready to go to questions. I know we have some out there, but I'll end with 2 questions for each of you. Sami, how can folks on this call both support your work in particular that you're doing and be agents for a different way of relating, for Americans to relate to the land that you live in a way that would be more predicated on the work of peacemaking and conflict resolution and all those things? So anything you want to suggest that we could do that would help what you're doing and create a different reality there at the same time?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing I would really encourage people to do is to really, and I don't do this often, but to really support us during this time as an organization. We actually feel that the work of healing and the work of transformation and building a new momentum for nonviolence is ripe, even in this time that we are living in, even with the pandemic. The frustration that exists within the community, the frustration that exists within the young generation, and I would say specifically within the Palestinian young generation, the need for something new. They are rejecting what is, but they still haven't developed a vision for what is it that they want. And I think there's a great opportunity to engage with the younger generation, men and women, Palestinians, that can really manifest something that goes beyond our leadership that has existed for so long until this time. And so I think supporting our work, and I would say specifically financially at this time, is key for us during this time. And then people can support through our website, theholandtrust.org. Regarding the second question, for me, it is people that need to get out of the comfort zone, as we've been saying, and to engage in peacemaking. For me, it breaks my heart to see what the United States has become today. I am a Palestinian and I'm also an American citizen. And for me to see the violence, to see the hatred, to see the animosity that has grown, and it's not just during this era. Of course, we all know it's always been there, but it's just really sort of like a volcano. It blew up in the last 4 years. There is a lot of work that needs to happen in the United States, and people need to engage in it. We cannot just sit behind our computers and criticize this and blame this. We are called to engage in peacemaking. And so, yeah, get out, put your face masks and get out and do peacemaking.
And so we put the link to Sami's organization, Holy Land Trust, in the chat, but we'll also follow up with an email that includes resources and links. And so, yeah, please be generous in these ways. It's incredibly important right now, especially in Bethlehem, because you're coming to us from a time when Bethlehem has been under months of lockdown at different points and in different degrees, but also in which the economy, which is very much connected to tourism, has been devastated. It was already fragile, and it's been there's the enormous impact from the lack of pilgrims and tourists coming. So so this is an important time for our friends at Bethlehem. Stu, you came back from your first trip over there with just this creative burst, and
Yeah.
you made an album called the Beatitudes Project, and it's really a beautiful collection of songs with in collaboration with a lot of artists in Nashville. And then you wrote a book called Words from the Hill, and you even have a study guide for that that small groups can do. And then you made a film about the whole thing too. And so you have just poured so much of your creative genius into this project. So how can we connect with what you've been doing with the Beatitudes Project?
Yeah, thank you, Todd. So we have put everything, all of those resources is now in an online e-course, and that can be found at thebeatitudesproject.com. So yeah, and like the reason why I've done it really is so that people can engage with stories like Sami's, you know, and with people like Sami's. And, you know, for instance, in Mercy, we look at what does mercy look like to a woman who'd been on death row for 27 years. And for all women who are survivors of prostitution, addiction, and trafficking here in Nashville. So there's some great stories in there. Poor in Spirit, we looked at literal poverty with the poorest of the poor in India, and then asked a multimillionaire on Wall Street what poverty of spirit looked like to him. And so it's full of stories that we can learn from, and I hope that the reader, the listener, whatever, you know, kind of partakes in, like learns from them and can go and find out more about those projects and those things. So there's a podcast up on Apple Podcasts or wherever you find your podcast called the Beatitudes Project. The music is streamed on all the streaming services, but you know, really the beatitudesproject.com is where you'll kind of, you know, find that thing and be able to engage with that. So I appreciate you lifting that up.
Absolutely. It's beautiful stuff. I really encourage you guys to check it out. So at this point, we will start to take questions. David will manage this. So David will pull the questions out of the chat and either unmute you or ask you to unmute. I'll leave it to you, David, to give people instructions how to ask their questions to Sami or Stu or to both.
Sure. Jennifer, you had a question. Would you like to ask it?
Sure. I was just wondering, Sami and Stu, how do you go about developing relationships when there are, like in Sami's case, literal walls separating you from, you know, Israelis? So how do you reach out as a practical matter to develop these relationships? And Stu, I have to say, I'm really impressed that you made phone calls and just reached out. That took a lot of courage, and so I'm very impressed with that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And fully, it's not easy. We are completely restricted in our movement as Palestinians. We cannot move out of Bethlehem without having special permits issued by the Israeli military, and Israelis are not allowed to come here without having permits also issued by the Israeli military to come into Palestinian controlled areas. But this said, where there's a will, there's a way, and this is what we engage in. I have Israeli friends who actually come and sneak me into into the other side and to meet with Israelis, and then many Israelis sneak in to come to Bethlehem and to be with us and to learn with us and to connect with us, and we're able to hold gatherings. We have a project now, for example, that we are engaging in, which is bringing Israelis and Palestinians to engage in addressing the occupation nonviolently by looking into the environmental damage done, the ecological and environmental damage done by the occupation on Palestinian land. And it's called From Dialogue to Action. And it's a great project, 40 participants. And we are meeting even during this pandemic, even with the closures, learning together and engaging in developing different projects at this point in the Jericho area to really address the effect of the occupation on Palestinian farmland and Palestinian farmers. And so in a way, I would say we should never allow anything to hamper us from doing the work we are called to do. There is always a way to reach out to the other side. And what we're seeing also are many Israelis, interestingly, at this time, where they are beginning to see this form, and they're using the word totalitarian system emerge in Israel itself. Many Israelis are reaching out to us, and for the first time saying, now we know what it feels to be a Palestinian, because they are now suffering from a system that is under their own government, that is denying their rights and limiting access to information and suppressing them and so on. So now they're beginning to get a sense of the injustice that Palestinians are facing, and they are even reaching out to connect with us. And so there are peacemakers on both sides that are engaging. There are Israelis that are working real hard on the Israeli society all the time. Even if we're not able to reach there are those that are doing the work and spreading the message.
Yeah. I would say that, and I really appreciate that question too, Jennifer. But I had lots of shut doors and non-returned emails and phone calls. I think that it requires someone that is willing to listen to you as well. So but I think the key is not to give up. That's the one of the things that I so admire about Sami.
Thank you both for the answers.
Thank you.
Andrew, you asked a question early on. Andrew Larson, would you like to ask that now to the speakers?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Hi, Sami. Thank you for your voice. It's just continue to speak so much truth. So I know that you personally work deeply in bridge building and peacemaking, but in my sector, and then especially within the American Christian community, there's so much pushback to engaging Muslims in this work. And whether it's explicit or implicit, there is a strong Islamophobic pushback an element. And I'm just would like to ask how you deal with that. And I'm hearing you say that some of your partners, some of your best partners and mentors are Muslims. If there's any little things that you do or stories that you've experienced that can help us in that work, in that piece of the work.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Yeah, I mean, we definitely don't experience anything like what's happening in the United States with this insanity of Islamophobia that exists there. For us as Palestinians, Christians, and Muslims, for decades and centuries, we have lived in peace with each other. I work with the Muslims, as I said, in the office we have Muslims. I have Muslims on the board of Whole and Trust that love the work and fully support our work. When we engage in training and our work here, it's, the Christian community is 1.2% of the Palestinian community. So if you want to develop nonviolence, if you want to develop leadership, it's the Muslim community you have to engage in. And so it's I agree with you. It's really, really sad to see what American Christianity has become in terms of how they relate to others, Muslims and different groups as well. But my encouragement is to keep, as Stu said, keep reaching out, keep engaging, keep building the bridges. And it's very important not to build the bridges out of fear. This is where I think we've talked about failed peacemaking, because we are afraid of them. We want to somehow reach some agreement with them, like if they know me, they won't hurt me, kind of thing. That doesn't work. You have to really, really, in humbleness, engage in listening to their story and knowing who they are and where they come from and what their issues are. And it's not about debating theology and debating their religions. They have their belief systems. They believe what they believe. If the Spirit is going to work on them, they will change. But it's not about us this debating and arguing my faith against their faith and trying to convince them of my faith. It is all about humbleness and mercy and reaching out to them and connecting with them and building community, as we've been sharing. Build community with them and become a beacon of light in the darkness that exists there already.
Roseanne, you had a question if you're willing or would like to ask it to our speakers.
Hello from South Africa to all the speakers.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm just in awe of the work that you all do, and I think the thing that strikes me, who's quite new on this journey, is just how under such extreme and long-standing oppression and injustices and humiliation, you manage to keep your hearts so pure and tender and not get bitter. Because I sometimes struggle with that. Yeah, thanks.
We all struggle with that.
Yeah.
I think the most bitter I get is towards myself sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, related to how do you keep your heart tender, what gives you hope?
Stu?
I don't know. I mean, this might be so twee of an answer, but my grandkids, like they have a way of looking at the world that is untarnished. And I feel like, when we talk about heart, the Beatitudes, Jesus said, "Blessed are the pure in heart," and we look at that in the project in a way of the pure heart is an undivided heart. And so when I look at my grandkids and see their undivided heart, where 1 minute, they can be having a tantrum, the next minute they're snuggling in your neck. When I meet authentic people who, when you know that what you see is what you get, like that gives me hope. And I'll never forget something that you said, Todd, actually, is that peacemakers act in hopeful ways. And that is a deep well of thought there. Like, how do we act in hopeful ways? How can we be bringers of hope rather than just keep looking elsewhere for hope all the time?
That thought is not original to me at all. I received that from a Palestinian pastor in Bethlehem named Mitri Rahib, who was for many years the pastor of the Lutheran Church there. But Mitri says that hope is not the same thing as optimism. And all of us know on this call that if you're looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or some of our own problems here at home, the pessimists have all the facts, but the optimism is not warranted, right? We're not paying attention, but hope is different than optimism. It's active. It's what you do, and you live and act in hopeful ways. And in doing that, you open up the potential for a different kind of reality to break in and break through. And so there's a big difference between hope and optimism. And the thing I'm always struck by is that people very committed to peacemaking find ways to remain hopeful by living out different things that they believe to be true, even when the reality around them doesn't, is very dismal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Phil, you had a question?
Yeah, I think, I forget if it was Stu or Sami touched on it, but the question was related to what you might call friendly fire from people in your own community for your activities in peacemaking. And how do you either address that or answer that? And we were just talking about hope. What does that create opportunities as well as distractions, so to speak? Or could you just talk to that a little?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you, Phil, for that. I think what's very important is that when you are persecuted, when you are attacked by your own community, is to engage in the same teachings as we have been talking about, to really understand what is behind it, what causes people to react in such a way. And again, it goes back to that core issue of what is their fear, what is their pain, what is their trauma, what is their grievance that they are reflecting on you because of your engagement. And for me, again, it is engaging and loving them and caring for them and crying with them when they're crying and laughing with them when they're laughing and celebrating with them and mourning with them when they're mourning. The worst thing to actually do is to become judgmental of your own community and then critical of your own community and blaming your own community. There are people who are engaging in conflict, who are in war, who have lost loved ones, have no way of expressing it. And sometimes they express it against those from their own community. And so again, it is how do we open our hearts towards them? When we got attacked, for example, we actually knew who did the attack against us. And they knew that we knew. And we refused to file police reports. We refused to take them. And we have engaged, not successfully, in trying to reach out to them and talk to them, for them to hear who we are. Many people follow rumors. Many people follow hearsays when it comes to things like this. And again, it is always asking the question, and this is, for me, a core value of peacemaking, is don't look only at the action, ask what is behind it. What causes a person or a community to be violent? And asking that question doesn't justify the act of violence. It gives you a deeper understanding so that you could end that cycle in the future.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
It's really good.
Colleen, you had a question?
Hi, Sami. My question, Sami, is in addition to funding that a program always needs, I'm wondering in what other ways we can partner with you in getting into the deeper roots that you work on. For example, you're talking about what are the roots of the fear, that hatred is maybe the defense against or the face off. I talked to you several months ago about this, and I remember you talking about collective trauma. Now it's several months later, maybe a year later, and I'm asking, as a psychologist, I think you have some background in that. We're forming a new coalition, maybe INGO, called Beyond Fear, because of the very reasons that you're talking about. So I'm wondering how we might be useful partnering with you.
For sure.
And would it be just on your context, or do you find it meaningful to be part of a larger conversation? So how can we partner with you?
Oh, for sure. Thank you. Thank you for the offer. And definitely, we are learning as we are moving along. And I don't have any background in psychology, and I regret that. I wish I studied psychology instead of political science. I would have been able to really understand this conflict more. But please stay in touch. I will actually put my email as well. Anybody who has ideas. We don't have the holy grail of peacemaking in this land. We are, as I said, learning as we are going along. And people like you and others who have supported us with knowledge, with information, with resources, we are more than happy to connect and to engage. Thank you.
I'll just make a final comment to you, Sami. In doing this, I met your project actually when I was there in 2016. But in meeting you and doing some work with women's groups in Zimbabwe, I just really hope everybody knows I have just learned so much from you people. It's a relationship of deep learning together. So thank you for the invitation and possibility, Sami.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Well, I want to just thank you both, Sami and Stu, for this time today. It's always a real treat and pleasure to me when I get to be in conversation with either of you and to have you together. It's been great today. So I personally really love this. Thank you to everybody who joined in today. It's been a great group, great questions, and I love seeing so many familiar faces and names out there. So appreciate that too. We didn't get to go through all the comments and questions, but you've definitely given us a lot of things to think about and to try to practice and live out in the days ahead. We know that the work is unfortunately far from over, and we want to invite everybody on this call to continue joining us in it, particularly by joining us for future webinars. Our next one will be in the new year, a conversation on January 7th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time with Ted and Kelly Haddock. If you're a Telos alum, perhaps you received the really beautiful Meditations on Peace coffee table book in the mail at some point this year. And we will have the photographer, Ted Haddock, from that book to discuss his work, and his wife, Kelly, her music, which has been very influenced by her experiences in the Holy Land as well, on our next webinar. We'd ask you to consider partnering with us through a tax-deductible donation to support our ability to continue to host discussions like this. This is the little Telos commercial or promo at the end, but we are in our end-of-year campaign. And we are a nonprofit that is funded by people like you and many of our donors I see on the call right now. But we would appreciate you putting us into consideration in your end of year giving. And just please continue to show up for these webinars, stay on our newsletter. If you're not already signed up, make sure that you sign up to receive the Telos newsletter and that you get the information that we pass out and these opportunities, and stay in this conversation with us together. We have to, whatever we're doing, we have to do it together and in community and across our lines of difference, which is again key to how Telos thinks about the world. So for all of you celebrating holidays this season, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, enjoy your holidays or your time with family and friends to whatever extent you can in the era of COVID. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.